I stepped into the lobby of the Belmau Hotel on a gloomy Friday morning in mid-September. It wasn't cold yet, but the ocean breeze from the western coast slipped through the seams of my coat, making me shiver. This hotel, where my entire family would gather for our annual reunion, was a Spanish-style building, fully renovated with modern interiors and a direct view of Half Moon Bay. They called it a bonding getaway. I called it 3 days of peeling back polished lies. There was just one thing they didn't know this time. I was the new owner of Belmare, listed on the final deed transfer my grandfather left me 6 months before he passed. My grandfather, Charles Whitmore, wasn't the affectionate type, but he was the only one who ever looked at me without comparing me to someone else. As a child, I'd spent hours in his library, listening to him talk about failed investments and the philosophy of running a business rooted in trust and instinct. Those memories never left me. I never thought he would leave Belmare to me, and I certainly never thought I would hide it from my family once we reunited here. But I had to. I needed to see them clearly, without the mask of manners or the illusion of blood ties. The revolving door turned. I saw my mother, Ellen, standing near the front desk, one arm wrapped warmly around my sister Madison's shoulders, smiling brightly as a staff member offered a tray of champagne. She always saved her warmest smiles for Madison, the successful daughter, now a regional marketing director for a wine company in Napa. No one looked up when I walked in. I approached the desk on my own, set down my suitcase, and nodded lightly to the front office manager. "Vivian Whitmore," I said, voice low but clear. The assistant manager, Mark, recognized me immediately. His eyes flickered with concern. We had an agreement. No employee was to reveal my true identity during this family trip. I didn't want them acting differently just because I owned the place. "Miss Whitmore," Mark said quietly, "everything has been prepared as requested. Room 207, correct?" I shook my head. "No. I want the room my mother assigned me. Same as always." Mark looked surprised. "The one next to the laundry?" I nodded. "Exactly. I want to see just how low they'll put me this year." Mark hesitated, then gave a quiet nod. As I turned back, Madison spotted me. Her face lit up for a brief second, then dimmed just as fast, like a switch being flipped. "Oh, you came too?" My mother said nothing. She gave me a cold glance, then returned to chatting with a newly arrived relative. I accepted the room key from Mark and walked toward the elevator. My heels clicked sharply against the marble floor. Each step felt like it carved through the thickening air. I hadn't come here to expose anyone or to demand recognition. I came because I needed to know. When did the disregard begin? Why, after nearly 40 years of living, was I still treated as the outsider in my own family? And to find that answer, I was willing to stay in the room beside the laundry, sleep under a ceiling that trembled from water pipes, eat breakfast alone behind a decorative column. Not because I didn't have a choice, but because this time, I was the one watching. Room 116 sat at the far end of the first floor, wedged between the storage room and the employee laundry. When I opened the door, I wasn't surprised. The beige walls were chipped, the small window faced the parking lot, and the industrial dryers next door roared like jet engines. The twin bed was pushed into a corner, its thin blanket nearly see-through. I sat down, still wearing my coat. Nothing had changed from last year, or 7 years ago, except now I knew for certain every decision had intent. That evening was the welcome dinner at Sea Salt, the ground-floor restaurant. A long table was set by the sea-facing glass. My mother took the central chair next to her new husband, Ken, and Madison, wearing her signature white off-shoulder dress, makeup flawless like she was prepping for a live segment. I arrived right on time. As I entered, I saw my cousin Natalie frown, then quickly turn away. One seat remained, partially hidden behind a decorative column, so far from the rest that I had to lean to hear anything. I said nothing, just walked over and sat down. My mother cleared her throat. "Let's begin." I hope everyone enjoys these 3 wonderful days at Belmare, especially Madison, our newly appointed Western Regional Director. Applause echoed. I clapped too, lightly and politely. Madison raised her glass. Thank you, Mom. And thank you all. I'm just doing my part. My Uncle Gregory leaned forward. Vivian, how have you been? Still freelancing or something? I nodded. Yes, I still run my studio. Madison smirked. That logo design studio? I thought everyone was using AI now. Laughter rippled across the table. Uncle Carl added, Tough gig these days, huh? Don't be shy, Vivian. You know we always help family. I pressed my lips together and glanced down at my glass of water. I hadn't touched any wine. Not for moral reasons, but because I needed a clear head. Natalie turned to Madison, deliberately loud. Did you see that new branding portfolio? The one for the fashion house in Soho? Incredible. Whose work is that? Madison asked, disinterested. Bluefinch Agency. New name, but super professional. I almost laughed. Bluefinch was my studio. But I didn't say a word. They'd never guessed that was even a possibility. Just then, Chef Raymond appeared at the table in his crisp black uniform. He stopped in front of me and gave a slight bow. Miss Vivian, did the salmon salad meet your preferences this evening? I looked at him and smiled. Perfect. Thank you, Raymond. A brief silence followed. Madison stared at me. You know the chef here? We've worked together once or twice, I said calmly. No one asked more. No one wanted to dig deeper. The silence drifted through like a cold wind. I kept eating, quietly. When dessert was served, a chocolate mousse topped with berries, my mother started up again. Madison, remember to bring your marketing team to the event in New York next year. And Vivian, you're still working from home, right? I nodded. Mostly, yes. She gave a dry smile. Maybe that's a good thing. Saves money on office rent. Madison crossed her arms. You should think about switching careers. That little studio probably brings nothing but stress. I looked at my sister, not angry, not surprised. That same tone 10 years ago, when I dropped out to pursue design, when I turned down a job at Dad's friend's firm, when I chose to make it on my own. I pushed my dessert fork aside and stood up. I'm going out for a bit. Stepping out of the restaurant, I looked toward the ocean. Waves crashed against the breakwater, powerful, cold. I woke up at 6 a.m. the next morning to the roar of the industrial dryer next door. Morning light filtered through the too short a curtain, casting a pale beam onto a chipped wooden chair. The room still felt as cramped as my memories, but this time, I didn't feel angry. I got dressed, tied my hair up, and left before the alarm rang. The hallway was still empty. Old, still life paintings hung on the walls like time had no intention of interfering. On the way to the first-floor cafe, I ran into Savannah, the morning shift barista. The young redhead had once interned under my grandfather and was now a full-time staff member. When she saw me, she stepped away from the grinder and gave a slight bow. Good morning, Miss Vivian. I made your almond latte just the way you like it. I kept a slice of banana bread warm in the covered box, if that's okay. I glanced around. The hallway was still empty, then nodded gently. Savannah, can we keep it casual, like I'm just a guest? She blushed. I understand, but truthfully, it's hard for the staff to pretend you're not important. I smiled, took the hot coffee, and left without another word. On the lid, she had drawn a small finch, the logo I designed for my own studio. After breakfast, the family split into 2 groups, one for the vineyard tour, the other for morning meditation at the spa. I claimed a headache and slipped away, heading to the 4th floor, where my grandfather's private office used to be. The dark wood door with the carved wolf crest, the Whitmore family symbol, was still there. I used a personal key, opened it, and stepped into the familiar space. Sunlight streamed through the tall window facing the ocean. Gray velvet chairs, old filing cabinets, the black marble desk, all still polished daily. On the desk sat a silver-trimmed wooden box. Inside were old maps, unfinished documents, and my grandfather Charles's personal journals. I was reading a section where he wrote about his son-in-law and grandson-in-law trying to pressure him into selling the hotel below market value, when there was a knock on the door. I quickly closed the journal. The door creaked open and Madison peeked in. "What are you doing in here?" she asked, suspicion thick in her voice. "Just looking around. You know I used to spend time here as a kid." Madison stepped in, her eyes scanning the room. "Weird. I tried to come in yesterday, but the staff said only authorized people are allowed." I shrugged. Maybe they were mistaken. I spoke to Mark. He said I just needed to let them know. Her brows furrowed. "You know Mark personally?" I smiled. "I know a lot of people. You've just never asked." Her gaze didn't waver. "Then why did Savannah call you Ms. Owner this morning? I heard her. And it's not the first time." I stood and walked to the window, avoiding her eyes. Maybe she confused me with someone else. Or she was joking. Madison said nothing, just stared for a few more seconds before walking off, her face still puzzled. That evening, during the second dinner on the third-floor bistro, I noticed the mood at the table shift. A few relatives, specifically Uncle Gregory and Aunt Carol, were watching me closely as I exchanged a short word with the restaurant manager. I only requested a vegan dish for the next day, completely ordinary, but I could sense they were used to a version of Vivian who didn't speak up. Any deviation from that seemed to unsettle them. When I stepped away to take a call, Natalie followed, her voice lowered. "What were you doing in Grandpa's office this afternoon? I saw the light from the hall. Aren't you afraid of being caught?" I looked her straight in the eye. "I have a key." Natalie hesitated. "Where did you get it?" I didn't answer. I tilted my head and walked away, leaving her standing, stunned, in the wine-colored hallway. The suspicion was spreading like smoke. I saw it in their glances, their whispers when I passed. And I kept watching, still not ready to show my hand. The next morning, I returned to my grandfather's office before sunrise. Mark had left a key at the front desk, along with a sealed envelope. "You'll need this." Inside wasn't just a key, but an old bronze access card, faintly engraved with Archive Room B3. It took me a few seconds to remember. B3 was where the legal records, financial ledgers, and personal letters of Charles Whitmore were kept. No one in the family had ever been allowed in, except his private legal advisor. The service elevator only worked with a card. I stepped inside, heart pounding, as the pale overhead light reflected off the metal filing cabinets lining the archive's walls. About 10 minutes later, I found a Navy Moon file box labeled Family Correspondence 2004-2018. Inside were dozens of handwritten letters, printed emails, and a few photocopies of contract drafts, all sorted with sticky notes marked with the sender's name. I flipped through the folders until I spotted a stack labeled E. Whitmore, Personal. E. Whitmore, that was my mother. I opened the first letter, dated July 15th, 2011. The handwriting was sharp, unmistakable. "Dad, I think you're spoiling Vivian too much. She's not fit to carry on the family's legacy. She's unrealistic, with no clear direction. She lives in a fantasy of art, and yet you keep insisting she has potential. That's not potential, that's irresponsibility." I froze. My hand trembled as I moved to the next letter, dated 2 years later. "If you continue letting Vivian access business documents, I fear the rest of the family will lose trust. You need to be transparent. Legacies should go to the one who deserves it, not just the one you love most." I didn't know how many letters I read. They were painfully similar. Calculated logic, cold language. My mother had spent years writing to my grandfather, convincing him that I was unworthy. Incompetent. Untrustworthy. At the bottom of the stack were handwritten notes from my grandfather. Never sent. One note in particular tightened my throat. "Ellen, every time you try to diminish Vivian, I feel you becoming more distant. You're my daughter, but jealousy is clouding your love. Vivian isn't perfect, but she shines in her own way. You don't see it because you refuse to look. I clutched that note like it was the only solid thing left in a collapsing world. At the very bottom of the box, I found a folder containing faxes, emails, and unsigned contract drafts. On the cover, proposed transfer offer, rejected. Inside was an email from my father, Dean, addressed to someone named Robert Sterling. Robert? Madison's husband. It was sent 6 years ago. The content was blunt. Charles is weakening. When the time comes, we need to act quickly, before he amends the will. I've arranged financing with the bank to purchase the hotel at the preset price. Make sure the notary is our guy. Attached was a hotel valuation report. About 40% lower than market value, a scheme to legitimize a takeover. At the bottom, Robert's scribbled signature appeared with a note. Ready to move when he loses grip. I closed the folder and slumped into the wooden chair in the archive room. A headache surged as if every buried memory ignited at once. Not just dismissal, but a calculated plan to cut me out of everything. When I returned to the fourth-floor office, Mark was waiting. Miss Vivian, are you all right? I shook my head. No, but I need time to think. He looked at me sincerely. Mr. Charles trusted you, and he knew exactly what he was doing. I nodded, eyes burning, but the confusion was gone. They hadn't just doubted me. They'd tried to erase every path to the legacy my grandfather left behind. That night, I appeared at dinner with hollowed eyes and barely any makeup. Madison glanced over when she saw me whisper something to the restaurant manager. The air around the table shifted when Raymond, the head chef, personally brought out my entree, announcing, "Tonight's special is a dish Miss Vivian once suggested to our kitchen." I kept the original recipe. Heads turned nearly in unison. Madison gripped her fork. Natalie stared at me like she had just realized she'd missed something huge all these years. I simply gave a faint smile and continued eating. That evening was the biggest dinner of the retreat, the Family Member of the Year celebration, a tradition my mother had started 3 years ago. It wasn't hard to guess Madison would be the honoree again. Everyone had rehearsed their praise. The Belmare's grand banquet hall was adorned with white flowers edged in gold, and light from crystal chandeliers danced across satin-covered tables. I walked in wearing a minimalist black dress. No gems, no frills, just a soft silk ribbon tied at my wrist. A silent reminder I no longer needed anyone's permission to be present. Madison stood beside my mother at the head of the table, holding a wine glass. "Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Mom, for always believing in me," she said in the polished tone she used for company presentations. I sat at the far end of the table, like always, but this time I could feel more eyes on me than ever. There was unease now, perhaps because I wasn't as silent as they remembered. The meal unfolded amid rehearsed laughter. People discussed Madison's upcoming trip to Europe, Uncle Carl's third home in Florida. Then suddenly, from the middle of the table, Natalie spoke up, no longer sounding politely cheerful. "Vivian, I saw you coming out of the fourth-floor office this afternoon. Grandpa Charles' room. I thought that place was closed." The table paused. I set down my glass. "I have the key." Natalie blinked. "Wait, why would you even have—" Madison cut her off. "Probably asked a staff buddy again. Don't make it a big deal." I turned to my sister, voice steady. "No need to ask anyone. I have legal access to every part of this hotel." My mother's expression hardened. My father leaned forward slightly. Robert, Madison's husband, looked ready to object, but Natalie jumped in, visibly shaken. "Hold on, are you saying you have some kind of role here?" Silence. I took a deep breath. "Actually, I'm the owner of Belmare." The wine glass in my mother's hand froze midair. Madison let out a sharp laugh. "There you go again, spinning your little fairy tales." It's not a story, I said, my voice even. Grandpa left the hotel to me through a trust. I've been the legal owner for 6 months. Ridiculous, Robert snapped. If that's true, why have you been staying next to the laundry room? To see how far you all would go, I replied flatly. For 38 years, I've been cast as the unqualified one. Because I didn't do marketing, didn't get an MBA, didn't live up to the mold my mother designed, I said, turning to my father, then to Robert, and because I wasn't the kind of pawn this family hoped I'd be. Robert went pale. I continued, my studio, Bluefinch, serves clients across 3 continents. We have 30 employees and made nearly $3 million in revenue last year, with a profit margin over 25%. And yet, I've never once heard anyone in this family ask me about it. Not once. My mother still hadn't spoken. Her gaze was vacant. Madison exhaled, visibly disbelieving. I leaned forward slightly. Mom, you wrote more than 10 letters to Grandpa, insisting I wasn't fit to inherit. I read every word. And Dad, I saw the email you and Robert sent, offering to buy this hotel for 40% under market value right before Grandpa passed. Silence hung over the room like a storm without wind. I never asked why you all looked down on me, but now I don't need an answer, because I understand. What scares you isn't that I'm inadequate. It's that I could succeed without needing to be handed anything. Robert slammed his hand on the table, rising. So this is just a power play, and you think you've won? I didn't respond. I just gave a faint smile and stood up. Keep your little celebration. I don't need a seat of honor. Because in the end, truth doesn't need a pretty chair to be heard. The atmosphere was still heavy when the door at the far end of the room suddenly opened. A sharply dressed older man entered, carrying a dark brown leather briefcase. I turned to him, nodding slightly. Everyone, I said, addressing the room. This is Mr. Peter Langford, my grandfather's personal attorney for nearly 30 years. He's here today, under the instructions outlined in a sealed provision of the trust, which was to be opened on the 6th day after the entire family gathered at Belmare. Mr. Langford quietly opened his briefcase and removed a large envelope and a set of neatly bound documents. Thank you, Miss Vivian, he said, before turning to face my family. As stipulated in the final clause of Charles Whitmore's will, I am required to present the asset transfer documentation and read aloud a personal letter handwritten by Mr. Whitmore to be revealed precisely at this moment. He opened the file and pulled out the first legal document. The Belmare Hotel was transferred into the Whitmore Legacy Fund on April 12th of last year. The sole beneficiary is Vivian Whitmore. No conditions. No shared ownership. No co-management. I didn't turn to look at my family. I simply listened and felt the subtle shifts in the room. A glass hastily set down, a chair scraping, someone swallowing hard on the right. Mr. Whitmore bequeathed full operational control, asset rights, and brand authority of Belmare to Vivian, Mr. Langford continued. But more importantly, he left behind a final letter he asked me to read to all of you today. He opened the thick envelope and carefully removed 3 handwritten pages. To my family, if you're hearing this, it means Vivian has officially assumed stewardship of Belmare. And I hope that by now, you're ready to listen, not just with your ears, but with your hearts. In my final years, I saw what was happening to this family. I saw the rivalry, the judgment, the quiet cruelty wrapped in polite smiles. I watched you spend so much time comparing each other that you forgot every person carries their own worth. I looked at my mother. Her eyes hadn't left the page, but her hands had gripped the armrest tight. I didn't choose Vivian because she's the most accomplished. I chose her because she's the only one who treated everyone with sincerity, even when it wasn't returned. She holds something most of us have lost: patience and unconditional kindness. My mother lowered her gaze. I saw her shoulders subtly tremble. Ellen, you are my daughter. I never stopped loving you. But I couldn't ignore how you cast aside your own child simply because she didn't match your expectations. Love is not pressure, and it's never denial. Silence blanketed the room. No clinking utensils, no forced laughter, no whispered side comments. Stephen Roberts, I knew exactly what you tried to do in my final months. I'm not angry, but your actions only confirmed that Vivian is the only one capable of protecting this place without putting profit above principle. Robert sat frozen. My father lowered his head. Belmare isn't just property. It's a legacy of trust. Anyone can buy a title, but not everyone deserves to be a guardian. Vivian, if you're hearing this, don't let them make you doubt yourself ever again. You don't have to shout to prove your worth. You only need to keep being you. Mr. Langford's voice softened as he read the final line. I gave you Belmare not because you needed it, but because this family needs you. Lead them into the light, if they're still willing to follow. The father and grandfather, Charles Whitmore, couldn't hold it in. My chest felt tight as I listened to each final word, not because I wanted them to know I was right, but because, for the first time, I no longer felt alone in this family. Madison bowed her head. Natalie whispered something to her husband, her eyes still red. My mother still stood in front of me, eyes rimmed with pink, no longer cold, no longer shielded by pride. Just a 62-year-old woman struggling to face the mistakes that had silently fractured our relationship for nearly 4 decades. You may not need my forgiveness, she repeated, this time her voice clearly trembling. But I will do everything to earn it. I looked at her, but didn't respond immediately. Some apologies don't require acceptance. They require time and action. Madison got up and walked to the head of the table, gripping Robert's hand as if expecting him to speak up for her. But Robert just clenched the back of his chair, then suddenly stood. What is this? He snapped, looking around. Everyone's bowing down to her now. The same woman who was written off as a failure suddenly becomes a saint because she held onto a trust document? I didn't flinch. I met his eyes, calm and steady. Robert let out a sharp laugh. I invested over a year preparing to take over Belmare. You have no idea what I was building, Vivian. Don't think a few lectures on morality qualify you to run a hotel. I never thought that, I said. But I do believe running a hotel requires integrity. Something you've never valued. What you have was handed to you, Robert sneered. I had to work for everything. And now I'm being cut out because that old man chose the wrong heir. Madison turned to him and pulled her hand away. Robert! Don't defend her, he barked. You know I'm right. No. Madison shook her head, her eyes suddenly clearing with realization. I know you used me as a tool to access Belmare, and now I see. You never accepted my family, or me, unless it was useful. Robert stared at his wife. But this time, Madison didn't lower her gaze. She stood straighter than I'd ever seen her. I'll be leaving this hotel tomorrow morning, Robert said coldly, and I don't want another call from anyone in your family. He turned and walked out. No one stopped him. The door slammed behind him, like the final period at the end of a long, hollow play. I turned to my father. He was still seated, hands on the table, his face solemn. Everyone kept saying Grandpa chose the wrong person, I said quietly. But no one ever asked why he made that choice. My father exhaled. Because he knew better than all of us. Then why didn't you ever speak up when Mom and Robert tried to cut me out? I asked. Why the silence? He looked at me, more tired than I'd ever seen him. Because I was weak, Vivian. I thought siding with you would shatter whatever peace was left in this house. And now I know, silence can be its own form of cruelty. Natalie, still at the far end of the table, propped her chin on one hand. I used to think you were just quiet because you had nothing to say, she murmured. Now I realize your silence was a kind of patience I never learned. Madison whispered. You never wanted to win, did you? I responded calmly. I just wanted to be seen. as a person. Nothing more. My mother placed a hand on the table. Vivian, I didn't hate you because you failed. I hated you because you didn't need me to succeed. None of us said anything after that. That sentence was too real. I didn't forgive her in that moment, but I knew, for the first time in my life, I had heard the one truth I had always felt, that love is not always lost. Sometimes it's just twisted by shame and fear. I stood up slowly, not to walk away, but to end one chapter of my life. Tomorrow, I'll be hosting a meeting on the 4th floor conference room. Not to divide shares, but to talk about the future. Anyone who wants to be part of it, be there. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the frosted glass of the 4th floor meeting room, casting a soft glow. I sat alone at the head of the table, behind the old painting my grandfather once hung, a bird flying over a mountain range with a handwritten note in silver frame. Freedom is not escape from others, but understanding yourself. The door opened. The first person to enter was my father. He nodded at me like we were both beginning from zero. Madison followed, calm and composed. Natalie came in next, then Uncle Carl, Aunt Carol, and finally, my mother. She didn't speak, but her eyes had changed, no longer searching for fault, just quietly open. I stood, my hand resting gently on the folder in front of me. "Thank you all for coming," I began. "This isn't a session to accuse anyone. Last night was enough. And it's not about dividing assets. I've asked you here to discuss something bigger." I opened the folder and pulled out a proposal. At the top, it read, "The Whitmore Family Foundation, a new chapter. I'd like to create a family council. Not to manage the hotel, but to oversee community efforts and preserve the values Grandpa left us." Natalie lifted her head. "Like an ethical advisory board?" I nodded. "Exactly. None of us is perfect. But if there's anything worth preserving, it's the spirit he lived by, and I believe we can do that. Together. So, how will the hotel shares be divided?" Uncle Carl asked directly. I met his gaze. "For now, I retain full legal ownership, as stated in the trust. But under the expanded agreement, Grandpa authorized me to allocate partial shares to those who show long-term commitment, not through words, but through meaningful action." I continued. "There won't be equal splits. No one can win me over with flattery. Every person here will need to rebuild trust, not with me, but with themselves." "And who gets to decide that?" Madison asked, sounding like she was finally taking it seriously. "I'm the final decision-maker," I said. "But I'll rely on evaluations from the Oversight Committee, department heads at the hotel, and community partners. Everything will have clear criteria, no emotions involved." No one objected. There were no mocking laughs, no whispers, just silence. And that was the best sign I'd ever gotten from my family. I ended with a line my grandfather once told me when I was 16. "Family isn't a place to win. It's a place where, if there's even the faintest chance, you give each other the space to make things right." My mother was the first to speak. "Vivian, I don't know if I still deserve it," she said slowly and wearily. "But if you're opening that door, I'll step through it. One step at a time. And I won't ask for anything but a chance to do the right thing." I nodded, not making promises, not rejecting her. Just acknowledging. My father stayed silent, but his face softened. "I don't need shares, Vivian. I just want, if I can, to do one good thing. Like your grandfather used to teach." Madison looked at me and gave a small nod. "If you ever need someone to help with communications for the community projects, I'll do it. Not for personal gain, but because you did something I never thought was possible." I didn't say anything more. I simply closed the folder and sat down, exhaling slowly. After all these years, I no longer needed their praise. I just needed them to help do something meaningful, no matter how late. 1 year later, I stood before the large glass window on the top floor of the Belle Mer Hotel, overlooking the bay glittering under the morning sun. Children's laughter echoed from the garden below, where we had just opened a new play area for students in our community scholarship program. That program was part of the commitment I proposed for the Family Council, allocating 5% of the hotel's annual profits to provide educational opportunities for local youth, especially those from underprivileged backgrounds. Within just 12 months, we had awarded 14 full scholarships and funded a culinary training class taught by Chef Raymond. That old, damp room, Room 116, had now been transformed into the Charles Whitmore Heritage Gallery. Visitors could view early hotel models, read my grandfather's handwritten letters, and even see the only family photo I had with him as a child, a photo I once thought no one in the family even remembered. My mother now came to Belle Mer every week, not to give orders, but to volunteer in the art calligraphy class she herself had proposed as part of our Healing Through Creativity program for older guests. I used to think art was a luxury, she told me one soft afternoon. Turns out, it's what holds people together. Madison, once the life of every party, had become the head of communications for Belle Mer's social responsibility initiatives. She didn't talk much about Robert anymore. Their divorce had happened quietly a few months after the day he left the hotel. One evening, Madison came to my office holding a draft of a new logo for the scholarship program. "I think it's time Belle Mer had a symbol that reflects what it truly represents now," she said. "Not just luxury, but opportunity." I looked at the design. It was an image of a bird spreading its wings, with a subtle line beneath, "Rise quietly, rise truly." My father, once a businessman who only spoke in numbers, was now leading a start-from-scratch entrepreneurship group for local young people. He taught them how to write business plans, seek funding, and recover from failure. "Every time I talk about my own mistakes, I feel closer to your grandfather," he told me during one of our council meetings. As for Roberto, he returned, not to apologize right away, but to ask, "For a job?" "I know I don't deserve it," he said, "but if you believe Belle Mer is about second chances, I want one." I gave him a role in the business development team, focused on finding partners in the Western states, not because I instantly trusted him, but because I believed in a system that knows how to supervise and offer opportunities fairly. And the truth is, he did well. Quiet, professional, no showing off. Maybe everyone, eventually, comes to understand. Value doesn't lie in where you've been, but in how you move forward. One autumn evening, I stood alone in the gallery. The room was quiet, filled only with soft piano music from the ceiling speakers. I sat on the bench facing my grandfather's photo. "You were right," I whispered. "True strength isn't in making them kneel and apologize, but in giving them the chance to stand again." Through the glass window, I looked toward the ocean, where the water reflected the last light of day. The wind passed through the old pines, rustling like my grandfather's voice telling stories long ago. Vivian's story reminds us that sometimes silence isn't weakness. It's a slow gathering of strength to heal. Instead of revenge, she chose dialogue. Instead of closing doors, she chose to open her heart. In a world full of competition and judgment, staying true to one's values and giving others a chance to change, that is real strength. Success isn't just ownership, it's knowing how to use it to connect, forgive, and rebuild what once felt broken. What do you think about Vivian's choices and how she handled her family? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to follow the channel for more heartfelt, inspiring stories about family and healing.